Captain Miller?
You call me what you
Is
like.
that all right? Okay.
Hey, you.
All right. Hey, you, Alec. Is that we've got about 2 questions out of our list of about 30, and then the men have spoken for an hour with very little. This is an interview on the 31st of March 2004 with Captain Alec G.W. Miller in Southampton for the Merchant Navy project. So thank you very much, Captain Miller, for coming to speak to us today, to share your experience of the sea with us and of the war at sea. And perhaps I could begin by asking you the same question that we've asked all of the veterans, which is, where were you born and brought up as a lad?
Oh, I was born and brought up here in Southampton. And whilst my father didn't go to sea, some of my uncles went to sea, some in the Merchant Navy, others in the Royal Navy, and I knew from very early age that one of my mother's brothers had been lost at the Battle of Jutland, and so we were a family who knew something about seafaring. In any case, I was born in Shirley, and if you were to draw a straight line down to what is now the container berth, I should think it would be about 1 mile away from there that I was born. So sights and sounds of shipping, boys at school whose fathers went to sea, took it for granted. A bit uncertain whilst at school, but in the late 1930s, you could hope a lot, but you couldn't necessarily make up your mind that you would do this or that, because there were lots of reasons, unemployment and things like that, which decided for you. But the war made it different. I was actually evacuated. I was 15 years old, didn't want to be evacuated, but my parents insisted, because although I'd sat for my school certificate, the results weren't out, and as Mother said, if the school was closed and I wasn't there, then if I'd failed, I wouldn't be able to sit again. So I was evacuated to Andover, where I had a very nice time. And when the results came out, I had passed. Not very high, but I had at least passed. So I immediately said, right, that's it then, I want to go to sea. This was in September 1939, and my parents arranged that I would go to the School of Navigation, Southampton, which was actually in Southampton in those days, although it's out at Warsash now. And so I was set up as a day boy at first, and as a boarder latterly. And things, of course, moved very quickly in that year, apart from the things that we were taught, which were necessary. There were other things which we were taught, such as how to be an ARP warden, was one thing we did for a while. And another was when the local defence volunteers, the LDV, were brought out, we were told to volunteer. Captain Wakeford, who is well known around the town, said to us one morning that he wanted, one Sunday morning it was, he wanted us all in working gear, and a lorry appeared. We were told to jump in the lorry, and we went to the avenue near to the Cowards Inn. We jumped out of the lorry, flung ourselves into a ditch, and looked up the road to see if the enemy were coming. And some military gentlemen came and looked at us and said ho hum or something like that. and we jumped back in the lorry and got back in time for lunch, which was good. But we were then issued with forms to fill up, and I took mine back to Captain Wakeford and said, "Excuse me, sir, but this says I am 17, and I am not 17, I'm 16, and some of the chaps in my watch are 15. And he said, "Right, not applicable." And so that was that. We joined the local defence volunteers, which afterwards became the Home Guard. People do ask how and why did people in the Merchant Navy have rifles, and that is the true story of how we got rifles. We didn't have a lot of ammunition. There was, I think, 5 rounds for each Ross rifle, very ancient rifles, and the cadet captains shared a revolver, which was, to my astonishment, not a 6-shooter. I thought they were all 6-shooters. It was a 5-shooter, and we had exactly 5 bullets. So, but we used to guard a roadblock out there at Swathling, and the enemy never came, so I presume we did some good. I don't know.
Could you tell us a little bit about your actual training at the college, at the as a seaman, as a cadet?
The training was very good. It was old-fashioned in that it was all shore-based. In later years, the cry went up that everybody should have experience in small boats, people should go to sea before they went to sea. In other words, there should be a training ship of some sort. But back in those days, everything was done ashore, and it was done very well. We did seamanship, knots and splices, and things like that, actually doing the jobs. We did do some marching up and down, which was thought by some to be unnecessary, but it was described as command training, and so it at least taught you to hold your head up and give your orders if you had to. And of course navigation was very, very well done. Our best navigation lecturer was taken away from us because the School of Navigation in those days was part of the University College, and the University College had an RAF reserve. And so the man who taught us navigation also taught navigation to the RAF reserve. And so he became Squadron Leader Branch, otherwise known as Twig, and he was taken away from us and sent to set up the Empire Air Training Scheme, by which they sent navigators across to Canada and taught them navigation in an aircraft there, and then sent them back to navigate when they got back again. And he, these were the sort of people who taught, who were teaching us. So the teaching was very good. Really, at the end of our 4 years, if we were apprentices doing 4 years, then we really shouldn't have needed to come back to college at all. We should have done enough practical work at sea, the theoretical, before we went. But of course, nowadays, the young men who go to sea have got to be in a very strict regime, and they do a certain number of months, and they go to sea for a number of months, and they come back for a number of months on a sandwich course sort of thing. But in our days, you could pick and choose, and since you weren't getting paid, you chose to do it as quickly as you could. So you could turn up at the college and say, there's an examination in 3 weeks' time and I want to sit for it. And nobody would say you nay. If that's what you wanted to do, that was it. In the case of people my age, of course, time has changed, and although we were setting out to do the equivalent of a 4-year apprenticeship, in fact, by 1942 perhaps, or might have been the beginning of 43, I've never seen the regulation, but a regulation was published which said that we didn't have to be 20 years old, and we didn't have to have 4 years at sea, but 3 years at sea and 19 would be enough. So we got temporary second mate certificates at the age of 19. We had then to get the time in afterwards, but so by the time you got your mate's certificate, you were where you should have been as far as time at sea was concerned.
When you finished your time as a training, and you finished your training, when did you first actually go to sea? Because you talked about your training being shore-based, which is more like the old-fashioned way. But when was your first voyage?
Oh, in August 1940.
Where did you leave from?
Left from London, very fortunately left from London, because it was just before the Blitz. But we loaded in the Royal Docks and sailed in the Port Caroline, which was, even then I should think, about 20 years old. Coal burner, burned 75 tons of coal a day, and did 14 knots with the wind behind it, which was quite good. It was also one of the quietest ships I've ever been on. It was steam turbine, and at night you could just hear the bow wave, and if the firemen down below shouted to one another, then the noise came up through the fiddly and up the back of the bridge, and you could hear them down there. It was very, very quiet, particularly at night. We joined a convoy. We went down to Gravesend, joined a convoy, went up to Methil. A German aircraft came and looked at us and fired a few machine gun bullets at somebody, but way over the other side of the convoy, nowhere near us. And then we joined a big convoy and went down more or less to Sierra Leone, where the convoy broke up. And we went on by ourselves, called in at Cape Town. I managed to get ashore and go to the office of Hunt Brothers, who were motor car importers, because I had an uncle in Johannesburg who worked for Hunt's. And so I went and said, I've got an uncle in Joburg, and they said, right, here's a phone. So I was able to speak to him. Wasn't much of a conversation, because he would keep asking me about the Blitz, and I knew nothing about the Blitz because we'd left. We went on from there to Tasmania. Hobart was the first port of call. We started discharging our cargo, went on up the coast, as was usual in those days, discharging in Melbourne, in Sydney, then Newcastle, New South Wales, which was the usual turnaround place, particularly for the coal burners, because it was a mining port. And so not only could the ship fill up with bunkers, but because it also exported steel, you could put steel down in the bottom of your frozen holds, and as long as you kept it frozen for a few days, you could start loading meat on top of it. And a lot of the ships came home with 1,000 tons or so of steel in the bottom of the ship and frozen meat loaded on top. we knew that things were happening because before we left the coast, we went to Fremantle and we were told to wait outside and didn't know what we were waiting for. Then one of the county class cruisers appeared over the horizon and went in ahead of us, and we found that they had got survivors of the Port Bowen, which had been a week ahead of us all the way around the coast, and had left and had met a raider not far out from Fremantle. So we knew that there was a raider in that part of the ocean at the time. But we went across to Durban and again filled up the bunkers. Then up to Sierra Leone, where we actually went into the harbour and again just topped up the bunkers with coal, and then came away in a convoy back home, which the whole thing took about 6 months. So that having gone away in August, I was back home again in February. To my delight, having done my 6 months in a coal burner, I was transferred to the Port Townsville, which was a motor ship, which was nice and clean, no bunkers, no coal bunkers, nothing like that, and loading for New Zealand. So everything seemed lovely. We were actually loading in Newport in Monmouthshire as it was then, although I believe now it's in Gwent. Loading all the general sort of things that you did for Australia and New Zealand in those days. And we sailed out of the harbour, out of the docks one night, but we only anchored off, and we had to wait the next day until we were told that the mines, any mines that had been laid overnight by enemy aircraft, had been swept. And having done that, we set off, and by lunchtime we were turning the corner at the southwest tip of Wales and heading north up the Irish Sea, when we were attacked by two Heinkels, I think they were. I was actually having my lunch, so the first thing I knew was that the alarm bells went, and very soon we were on fire, all sorts of smoke and flame and one thing and another. The engine stopped, the pumps stopped, and those in charge decided to abandon ship, which we did. The ship was well ablaze, because of course the insulation in all the holds, apart from the cargo that was down there, the insulation was wood and cork, and so Henry, the captain, decided the situation was impossible, and we took to the boats, and we were picked up by a little coaster called the Harptree Coombe, which took us in the general direction of Bristol. But then a French sort of chasseur, I think they called it, a Free French boat came out from Milford Haven, and we transferred to that, and they took us in. So that particular voyage, from the time it started to the time it finished, lasted just one day.
May I ask you a question, Alec, about, as a very young man, one minute you're having your lunch on board ship and the next minute the ship's on fire. What goes through your mind? Do you think about the duties that you've been trained to carry out, or do you, what were your thoughts on being attacked, particularly by aircraft?
Well, when you I think you hit the nail on the head when you mentioned the training. You could really say we didn't get any training. We were there to be civilian merchant seamen. That was what the training was all about. And when things like this happened, it was all a bit of a surprise to everybody. They knew it could happen. And you might even sail with some men who had been to sea in the Great War. But if we'd been better trained, we might have done something more about it. But as it was, the captain decided that the best thing to do was to abandon ship, and we did. But if you think in terms of what the Royal Navy does with various parties whose duty is to go and get bulks of timber and shore up bulkheads and do this, that, and the other, we had firefighting parties, but even the hoses and the pressures in the lines in those days were just about enough. But again, quite ordinary ships now, every ordinary ship now has an emergency fire pump. But there were no emergency fire pumps, there were fire pumps. But nowadays you'll find every ship has another fire pump. If its main fire pump is down in the engine room, the second fire pump may be up in the forecastle, it may be down in the poop, but it won't be in the engine room, so that they've got another fire pump. But we didn't have anything like that. So when you ask about our training, certainly as far as I was concerned, it was my second voyage to sea. I stood by my fire hose, which it so happened was on the after deck, and the bombs landed forward and went down number 2, and said that's where the fire was.
Did she sink?
Oh yes, she burnt out, yes. 2 passengers were killed by the bomb. Another passenger had a leg broken. The third mate got a bullet through his leg. And we abandoned ship.
And made it to Milford Haven.
Well, yes, we were taken into Milford Haven.
What happened? Would I be right in thinking that this is the moment that your pay stopped? Or you, I mean, as an apprentice, this isn't relevant, I suppose. But
I expect so. But I don't quite know why people make so much of it these days, because they didn't at the time. If you are paid by the voyage, which we were, if the voyage stops, your pay stops. That's taken for granted. Nowadays, people make a lot of fuss, I think, about it, but I can't remember hearing very much about it at the time. It seemed to be fairly obvious.
So what happened to you when you got to Milford Haven? Did you go back to London or to find another ship?
Oh, I was just handed well, first of all, a local tailor turned out on the Sunday morning. It was a Saturday when we were bombed. Turned out on the Sunday morning, and we got shirts and suits and shoes, whatever people wanted, according to what they'd got or hadn't got. And then we were given train tickets home. And I came home to Southampton, and by that time it was the middle of the night, and banged on the door, and eventually my mother called out something, "Have you come home for the weekend?" And I said, "No, I've been sunk," and that put the cat among the pigeons. And we started to get my gear back together again, because 10 days later, I joined the next ship, which was the Port Chalmers, which was a sister to the Port Townsville.
And did you join her in London as well, or where did you? Where?
No, I joined her in Liverpool.
Mm.
By this time, they'd given up, pretty well given up London. I joined her in Liverpool, and we did a quite remarkable voyage. We went out through the canal to New Zealand and back through the canal home with a full cargo of meat in something like 3 months, which was very
My word.
fast indeed.
How many knots could she do?
About 16 and a half, something like that.
So flat out all the way,
So
and flat out all the way
Flat
back.
out all the way, no convoy, no escort, just flat out all the way.
Where did you stop en route? You went through the canal, Suez Canal you're talking about?
No, Panama.
Panama Canal. And you, whereabouts did you stop?
We bunkered at Curacao, and then through the canal and to New Zealand. And we only did one port in New Zealand, that was Auckland. The captain in those days, Captain Higgs, who was a very well-known man in the company, the crew behind his back called him the Bishop. And one of the things about him was he was convinced that the apprentices would get into trouble. He'd seen a lot of apprentices and thought that one way of keeping them out of trouble was to make sure that they went to church on Sundays. And his idea of church on Sundays in Auckland was the cathedral, and we were asked if we would like to go to church. So of course there were 4 of us in the ship, but 2 of us said yes. The captain said, "I don't mind which 2 come, because the other 2 will come next week." So, but anyway, we went with the captain, and before we'd gone very far up the hill towards the cathedral, people were saying, "Captain Higgs, it can't be you, surely. You were here only a few months ago." And the captain said, "Oh, I have a very fine ship and a very fine crew. These are 2 of my apprentices," he's saying. And, oh yes. And this went on until we got all the way to the cathedral, where one of the, obviously he wasn't a church warden, but a gentleman of similar status, said, "My word, Captain Higgs, fancy seeing you. Does the bishop know you're back?" And Captain Higgs said, "No." But here was the bishop's wife, and the bishop's wife said, "Oh, we must go to the bishop's robing room." So we all went round to the bishop's robing room, where the bishop said, "Captain Higgs, back so soon. My word, you must have a very fine ship." And so there we were, sat alongside the bishop's wife in the first pew in the cathedral, and luckily we did know enough to know when to stand up and sit down, even if our singing wasn't of the best. One thing about Southampton School of Navigation being at South Stoneham, it was alongside South Stoneham Church, and the vicar was a rugger referee, and apart from that, we used to go to his church on Sundays. So going to the cathedral wasn't really an ordeal at all. But we came back and joined again to find that we were loading a very peculiar lot of cargo, lots of rumours. You're going to Bandar Shapur. Where the devil's Bandar Shapur? Oh, it's a new place they've opened up at the top end of the Persian Gulf. What does anybody want to go up there for? Oh, it's something to do with a railway line to Russia. very odd. But we didn't go to Bandashapur at all. We went to Malta.
When was this, Alex?
This was in 1941. There were 6 ships, a pretty big escort, and also the Navy had a group of, I think it was the Renown and the Ark Royal and some other cruisers, which was just cruising nearby in case they were wanted, sort of thing. But no, this was called Operation Substance. I can remember a destroyer named the Fearless being hit and set on fire, and that was eventually abandoned. We were attacked by torpedo planes and bombers. But the merchant ships all got there, all 6 of us. We lay about for a few weeks after we were empty. It became obvious that the Navy weren't going to send another escort in to get us out. And so they started sending us out 1 or 2 at a time to try our luck back to Gibraltar. We sent some of our hatch tarpaulins away, and the Navy painted big Union Jacks on them, and they welded eyes on our side and rove wires so that we could hang these big tarpaulins over the side. Sorry, what am I saying about Union Jacks? They weren't Union Jacks at all. They were French ensigns, which we hung over the side. We had a French ensign and as well, and we had 2 depth charges. They were quite ordinary depth charges. One was down number 2 at the bulkhead with number 3, and one was down the engine room in between the propeller shafts. These were depth charges which had the pistols taken out and a very ordinary detonator put in with a length of blue touch paper. The orders were that in the event that the French appeared and asked us what we were doing, we were to light the blue touch paper and retire immediately. Because I was an apprentice, I was then one of the messengers. Another fellow had the job of going to see the mate, who was down in the hold with his box of matches, and my job was to go down into the engine room and see the chief engineer and tell him to light the blue touch paper. However, although we were found by the Italians